All right, so welcome back to Hello World. Today we're going to be, last time we focused on HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, mainly learning HTML tags and some basic JavaScript stuff. This week we are going to delve into creating like a basic to-do list app with HTML and JavaScript primarily, and also just learn like all the important JavaScript language stuff that you need to know. So you should be able to pick up JavaScript pretty easily then. It's a really popular language. If you want to go ahead and grab this, so right here you can see a command to grab this kind of template file that I'm going to be starting from. If you weren't here last week, that's fine. Basically, this just has like the skeleton files you need for your project, a basic HTML file, standards compliant, a JavaScript file with nothing in it, and also a CSS file. So you can grab all of those. You can grab those with git clone. And then if you go up here to file and add folder to workspace, and then go to wherever you downloaded the file to. So in my case, it's right here. And add that, then it will pop up in your little VS Code Explorer here to the left. All right. So just to get kind of like recap what happened last time, we learned about all of these HTML tags. So basically, your web page is made up of an HTML file. So this would be an example of your web page that you make from an HTML file. You have everything goes inside of HTML. You have header for some meta information, like what other stuff to load, a title for your tab, and then the body has the main content. So if you want to actually open up this web page, then what you can do is open up a browser. And if you do Control-O, or Command-O if you're on Mac OS, and then navigate to that file and open up the index.html. That will get you, except that's the wrong one, but that will get you that kind of skeleton file that we're starting from today. The first half of this workshop or so, we're going to just be focusing on learning JavaScript concepts. Like what is JavaScript, how do you use it, what are the things specific to the language you should know. And in the second half, we're going to delve more into actually creating this application. Okay, so here's our basic HTML file from before. If you weren't here last week, this is the kind of how your browser works is it'll download these files from a server somewhere else, and that's how your web page displays. So this page you see here is the same thing that we're editing right here in this index.html. In order to make sure that your script is loaded, you need to have this script tag here. So you have this script, script.js is what I named it, but you can call it whatever. Inside script.js, you're writing JavaScript. So we have kind of a different file here for each language. We have our HTML in our HTML file and CSS here, JavaScript here. The very first thing you'll notice, so we have a console.log. I know I touched on this briefly last week, but I'm going to try to review it for people who weren't here. Basically, a console.log is just your print statement in JavaScript. We did have some questions as to like, okay, why doesn't this appear on the actual screen? That's because it appears in your developer console. So console.log isn't like what you really use to show output to like a user. That's what you would use. It's what you use to mostly to like debug. So if you head to your little like hamburger menu, or there's a keyboard shortcut for it as well. I know, I forget what it is, and then head to web developer, or there should be something similar in Chrome, and then toggle the tools. You'll get this little overlay console here. So this is where that console.log is going to come up. So you see this hello world from JavaScript. That's this hello world from JavaScript right here. All right, so that is that. Now, in JavaScript, you have variables, just like you would in any programming language. So there's two main ways that you want to declare these, const and let. You'll also see var sometimes, and you can declare a variable without it. So you can just say like a equals 5, but this is a bad idea because it'll let other scripts. If you declare without any keyword at all before it, and you just say variable name equals whatever value, then that will be able to be edited from any script loaded on the page. And for this program, it's probably not going to be a big deal because this is the only script we're loading. But if you have like advertising scripts or other scripts from other people you're running, it's dangerous to expose your variables like this. So never write variables like that. Always use one of these two is what you want to focus on. You'll see var sometimes in legacy code. You should avoid using it in new code though. you can always use let instead of var. It does almost the same thing. So stick to constant let. Const creates a constant. So you're not going to be able to reassign something if you use a constant. And you might be wondering like, okay, well, why would I ever use constant then? Because in case I want to reassign, I want to make sure I can do that. And that is a fair point, but generally it simplifies, it makes your code easier to read for other people if they know that certain things won't change. So imagine if you write something like this in your code, you could say const pi equals 3.14. Whereas if you have let pi equals 3.14, with the first one, they know, okay, anytime they see pi after that, it's for sure going to be 3.14. Like you can't change it out from under them. Whereas with this let, it doesn't necessarily enforce that. You can later say pi equals 23 or something. So that's why you want to stick to const when you can. But if you actually do need to change it, then by all means use let. If you want to like print the value of a variable, you can do that with console.log as well. So you can go console.log pi, and so what you want to do is save that file and then head back over to your browser. And if you refresh the page, then it will rerun your JavaScript and re-render your page. So you can see there's our 3.14. That's coming from our JavaScript file. So now that we know how to interact with that kind of browser console and console.log, let's talk about some of the other things in JavaScript that you need to know just foundationally. So how many of you know what a type is? If you've taken like intro to C and use like an integer or a string, how many people are people aware of like types and the different kinds of types you can have? Yes, okay. Good, yeah. So JavaScript also has types. JavaScript, however, is a lot more flexible about letting you change the type of your variable. So let's say, let's change this from pi. Let's just have it be a number, and we'll make it be like 5, for example. If you later want to let that be something else, a different type. So like in C, you could do something like this, right? This is totally makes sense. What you could not do is something like this. You can't actually go and change the value or the type of your variable. So if you started out as an integer or a float or whatever, you can't go and later change it to something else. In JavaScript, it will let you do that. Because you have to remember when JavaScript was designed, they intended for like designers who weren't maybe the best programmers to use it. So they kind of just let whatever fly and try to do the best they can. And this can be convenient at times, but it also can cause a lot of hassle. But so that's one interesting thing about JavaScript. You can reassign and you can change the type of variables as you go, and it's not going to complain about that. It just lets it happen. This is another good reason to use const, because if you use const, then you can never reassign in the first place. So there's no fear that your variable is going to like change type later. All right, let's actually leave that just so we can see. I'm going to go ahead and save that, and then we can go back to the browser. Oh, okay. So this is what happens. I must have not changed back to let. This is what happens if you try to assign to a const again. You'll just get an error in your console. Notice the page itself doesn't crash or anything. You'll just get an error in the console. Your JavaScript will crash, but the page itself will still load because your browser always tries to put forward a best effort. It's called best effort. It will always try to do whatever it can to keep the page running. It's not going to crash it unless there's absolutely no other alternative. So if we just change this to let to allow us to change it in this on line 4 here, then it should be happy with us. Okay, there you go. So you can see it's totally fine with us changing the value of that variable. All right, so the next most important thing you probably should know about is the function. If you've taken intro to C or something like that, you may have written functions like, I don't know, void, or let's say something like this. Let's write a simple sum function, because it's the one I always use. Oh, come on, VS Code, be nice. Okay. So you might have something like this. And there's a couple things you want to note about this that are going to be similar in JavaScript. So in C, you have to declare the types of everything, right? So you'd have to put int or float or character pointer or whatever you're actually passing in. Whereas in JavaScript, remember, we don't really care as much about the types. It's more relaxed on that kind of thing. So you just omit all of those. But in order for it to know that it's actually a function, you just type function in front. So that's kind of the only difference you have. This right here is a valid JavaScript function. If you're not familiar with a function, it's a pretty simple concept. Basically, a function takes in some values right here. So these are your parameters or arguments, depending, people call them different things. They're things that you pass in or you provide to the function, and the function will return you with this return statement here, a new value based on those parameters. The other thing a function can do is have some other side effects. So maybe you don't return something, but you instead log out, something like that. That's another possibility for a function. In this case, maybe sum wouldn't be the best. We could do something like print sum. All right, so if we go ahead and run this code, you'll see that it will, well, first we need to actually pass in two values. So instead of A and B, which aren't defined out here, we can do, I don't know, 5 and 10. So we take that, head back over to our browser, and you'll see it prints out 15 because it takes in the 5 and the 10, adds them together, and prints them out. One thing to note about this kind of function is they are hoisted. So you can do this. You're allowed to define the function before, like at the end of your file, and then use it ahead here. It might look kind of strange coming from like some languages, but it's a really nice feature because sometimes if it's just a minor function that doesn't really, it's pretty easy to interpret what it does. It can be nice to get that whole function body to the bottom where it doesn't bother anyone. You can kind of read the code a little more easily. So you can place functions wherever, it doesn't really matter. The other style of function you will see though that does not kind of have this hoisting behavior is a const style function. So the way you write a const style function is very similar to the way you create a variable. Just like you could do let number equals 5, or, you know, let's go back to our pi example. So const pi equals 3.14. You can do the same thing with a function. So we can say const sum equals function ab, return a plus b. This style in particular isn't commonly used. Usually the reason people do this is so they can use the arrow function. So the arrow function works the same way as a regular function. You just, instead of having the keyword function, you put an arrow between the parameter end of the parameter list here and your opening brace. Another nice feature about this is you can remove the opening braces and remove the return statement if you have a really concise function. So this is especially common. This idea of being able to just define a function, this is what we call a function literal or a lambda, an anonymous function. It's really useful in JavaScript and it's widely used for callbacks and different things we're going to actually get into today. So I would say in terms of which style you should prefer, there's no real like best way to do it. It's just what you like. But I would say make sure, this one is pretty easy to understand as a function. This one might be a little more confusing. So make sure you get used to seeing this because it's pretty common to have functions that are written in this way. Okay. When you want to call this, by the way, it works exactly the same way. No changes there. Okay, one other thing about semicolons. If you leave semicolons off, most of the time that will work in JavaScript. There are a few weird edge cases where it doesn't work, so I recommend that you always do include semicolons, but technically, for the most part, not including them won't have bad effects on things. Okay, so that's functions. Do we have any questions on any of that stuff? That's kind of all like intro CS stuff, so if you know, if you've taken a CS class before, you probably have covered something like that. Oh, one other thing that's kind of intro CS you should know. So arrays. Arrays are actually really nice in JavaScript. So you can just say we want to make an array is just a list. So you might hear it could be called a list or whatnot. I think Java calls it like array list, and everyone has their own name. But an array in JavaScript, you can just create a list. The way you do is use these square brackets, and then you just put the things you want to be in the list. So if I want a list of the first 5 numbers, I can just do that. If I want a list of strings, I can do that. That's perfectly fine. One thing you can do, although I don't recommend this, is you can mix types. So if you want to put a list of some numbers and some other things, you can do that. There are some cases where you might want to do something like this, but in general, it's probably a bad idea because people tend to assume an array will have all the same kind of thing in it. So that's arrays. They're pretty easy to make. If you want to index them, So let's say we want to print out hello. You just take the name of the array. This is just like C in most other languages. And you put the index. JavaScript is a 0 index language. So the very first element in the array will be referred to as 0. And if you have an array that's like 5 long, for example, your last element will be a 4. So that's just something to watch out for. But if you've written in other languages, you're probably used to that. This next thing is a JavaScript specific feature. So this is the object literal. So I know like my intro to C class actually hasn't gotten far enough to have like sort of objects, but basically the way you can think of an object is some data that's been bundled together. So when people are starting out, you often see them write things like this, for example, if I can type. Okay, so maybe they want to have player hit points of 100, and they want to have a name for the player as well. I don't know, and maybe one other thing, like a weapon. All right, so this might be if you're running like a simple like text RPG or something. So you have a player named Rob with 100 hit points, and he has a longsword as a weapon. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with using multiple variables like this, but you notice how they all kind of have this player prefix. They're all sort of related to the same idea. So really a better way to do this would be to bundle this into a type of its own. Because if you want to, the main reason this really comes up, because overall this isn't actually that bad if you're just going to use these variables directly. But what happens is you end up writing functions. So let's say we have a fight function, and we want to take in the player's name. And we need, of course, we'll also need the weapon that they're using. And we'll also need their HP. It can get pretty annoying to have to constantly type out all of that stuff, right? So it's not horrible, but that is a lot to type just to, even when this is all kind of one unified idea. Anytime you're looking at a bunch of different, if you're always passing the same variables together, like they're basically part of the same idea, you probably shouldn't, they shouldn't be separate variables. So what you can do is create one object that combines all those into one thing. So really what we're representing here is a player object. These aren't 3 distinct ideas. They're all sort of part of the same idea. And this player has a name, and they have an HP, and they have a weapon. This is probably new if you've only used C. This is similar to what a C struct can do for you. It is a little more flexible, but the nice thing about this is if you look at this now, if we want to pass the idea of a player, we just have to pass in the one player. We don't have to pass in individually all these different things. That will come with it. If you want to actually access this, so let's say we want to like print this player out, or use, how do you actually access these different attributes, right? You just use a dot. So you use the player, which is the kind of like object. And then inside the object, you have 3 sort of properties. You have name, you have HP, and weapon. So if you want to print out the name, you can just do player.name. And if you want to use the HP for something, player.hp. And otherwise, it works just like a regular variable. So if we got rid of this and instead just did the other way, then you would just use, you know, player name or whatever. It would all work. You can use an object property just like a variable, and you can pass around an object all as one chunk. So that's a useful concept that comes up a lot because you have different parts of data that really are kind of part of the same idea. So you want to bundle them together into an object. This is something that's unique to JavaScript. Not a lot of languages have such a concise syntax for doing this. But basically, all you have to do is you have your open curly, your closed curly, and then you put all your properties. And so you put the name of the property. So whatever the trait, you know, player dot whatever. So we want player dot HP, player dot weapon, player dot name. You put a colon, and then you put whatever you want the value of that to be. And those can be different types. One thing you do have to remember is put those commas. So if you don't, you can see VS Code's mad at me. You have to put a comma after each one except the last one. You can put one after the last one if you just like it to be symmetrical, but really it kind of comes from the idea that you can do this all in one line as well, in which case it kind of would look weird to have a comma there. But you can do it either way. It's just purely a preference thing. You can also interact with these just like any other variable. So let's say we want to add 100 to HP. You can do that. And then if we go and log that out, we should get 200. Hopefully this stuff makes sense. If you do have any questions throughout this, please put them in the chat so we can catch any confusion sooner rather than later. This is all pretty foundational programming language stuff. Okay, so that's all of the like JavaScript language specific, just like language things that you should know. The rest of this workshop we're going to spend on actually writing this to-do list application, which let me go ahead and pull that up right here. So it's pretty simple. There's not a lot of CSS. So if you remember, CSS is for styling to make it pretty. I didn't write a lot of CSS in this to keep it pretty simple. So it's just pretty basic. But what this is a sort of like to-do item list. So you might have an application you use, or maybe you just use good old-fashioned pen and paper to keep track of your to-dos. But let's say, for example, I need to do the dishes, right? So you can type that in, you can click this button, and it will create a little item here with a number. And it also has a checkbox. So maybe you get to it later, you can check it, it will cross it off, and then after a few seconds, it will disappear. And you can keep doing this. You can add new items. So let me add a whole bunch of items. All right, so we have some randomly numbered items here. One nice feature about it is you can check it, and if you decide you want to keep it, like you accidentally misclicked or something, you can check it again to remove that strike through and make sure it doesn't actually go away. So that's kind of the core of the whole app. So let's delve into actually how we might do something like this. So we're going to start over here in index.html. So we're mostly going to be writing scripts here, but we do need to kind of set up what our HTML is going to look like. So if you look kind of at this starting page here, let me refresh. You have this kind of text area here. So that's an HTML element. We didn't actually go over it last time, so don't worry if you're not sure what that is. But basically, the way you accomplish that is with an input. So it's another one of those strange ones that doesn't close. It just opens. And what you also need to include is a type. So you need to include, I believe it's type equals text. So if you go ahead and just delete all the stuff inside your body and put input type equals text, save that and head back over to your browser. So let me close this finished one, go back to you can see, okay, look, we have a text box here. Okay, cool. You can type things into it. Amazing. What we want to do next is actually go and add that button. So a button, that's actually another one we didn't cover last time either. So, and I right now have a bad track record for covering the ones that we're going to use today. But if you want to add a button, you just use button. So we want a button. Button is one that's closed. So the way a button works inside, so if you just put a button element all by itself, it won't actually render anything, I don't think, or maybe like a small, yeah, it doesn't actually render anything. What you need to do is actually put some text for the button. So we can use click me, for example. We have that, head back to our browser, and look, we have a button, and it's clickable. But it doesn't actually do anything right now. So this is basically the core of what our application is. We have this text area that you're going to be able to type in we have this button we click, and then we also, one other kind of invisible element you maybe didn't see on that original one is that list. So we need to create kind of that list with no items in it. So it won't display anything when we just start, but it will give us a place to add items later from JavaScript as the user types things in. So the way you want to do that, there's two options here. If you want bullets, you can do UL for unordered list. But I did numbers, so I want like my number, and so OL for ordered list. And you just go ahead and create that. OL, it closes. If you want to actually like use this just like to write in your own items, you just use list item, and then inside that kind of tag, you put what you want your item to look like. So if we do that, you can see, okay, that's how you create an item. But we don't actually want to start with any items, so that's why we're just creating this empty tag. And that's pretty much all the HTML we're going to be writing today. There's one other thing we'll have to do in a minute, but we can get that when we get to that. This is pretty much, most of our application is JavaScript. So the first thing we really need and this is not actually part of, people get confused a lot and think that these functions are actually part of the JavaScript language. They're only browser APIs. So if you run in something like node.js or another JavaScript runtime, they're not necessarily going to be available because like node.js, you're running on a server, there's no web page to interact with. So they are closely tied to JavaScript, but they're not actually part of the language itself. They're just nice APIs for us to use. Basically, we're going to be using a bunch of document functions today. So you have this global object called document, and document kind of represents the whole like web page document that we have. If we want to get access, so in order to actually like add items and wire everything up here, because like we can click this button, but how does it know what to do when we click the button? It doesn't, right? We have to tell it what to do in our JavaScript. So how do we actually like get access to this button that's in our HTML from our JavaScript? There's a few ways you can do this, but the best one is to use document. So first we want to create a variable for our button. So I'm just going to call it button, const button, but you can call it whatever you want as long as you use the same thing later on. And if you want to actually get access to so they're called DOM nodes. So anything, DOM is DOM like that, and stands for Document Object Model. So remember those objects I was talking about before? Everything that you get back from these functions is usually an object. And then the document, that's because we have this whole document, and then model because it's just kind of representing it. So for short, that's DOM. So you use document.querySelector. And inside the query selector, we point it to what element we want. So we want the button. You do need to put a hash in front of the name of the element here to indicate that it's an ID. Now, this is something else we need to do. So there's different ways to select things, but this doesn't actually select the button. You need to set the ID to button as well. So you can set ID equals button. You can also, it doesn't have to be the same as the name of the element either. So just to be less confusing, I'll use my button. Whatever you set ID equal to inside of your tag here is what you'll have to use here. So we can do the same thing here. Okay, so now we kind of have access to that button. We're also going to need access to this list, right? Because we're going to be adding new list items into that. And we need to be able to read the input from this input as well. So let's go ahead and add IDs to those. So I'm going to say text box for our input, and then for our ordered lists, I'm just going to say list. Okay, so we set those IDs. One thing to note about IDs is if you want to select multiple things, don't use the same ID. An ID is always intended to be only attached to a single element in your HTML. If you want to have something like select multiple, then you should use a CSS class, which we'll get to in a minute. But yeah, only use IDs for single things. Okay, so now that we have that, we'll be able to grab the rest of our elements. So let's grab our list. So there's two, you can also use get element by ID. That's the one I'm almost typing out, but generally it's preferred to use query selector because it's newer and it has better support for other things. But you can use get element by ID and it works the same way, except you just don't include the hash. Okay, so let's see what I think I called it list. And then I think I called, what did I call that? Text box. Okay. All right, so now we have our references to all the things we need. If we run this and we open up our console, we'll probably see an error. Oh, okay, not yet. Okay, but one thing you do have to watch out for this is if you notice in our order here, our script is above our HTML where we actually define these elements. So the way your browser literally works is it parses it character by character and it goes from top to bottom. So when it goes to this script, it's going to try to access those elements before they're actually created. So there's kind of two ways you can get around this. One way is you just move this to the bottom of your body. You put your script down here. But the preferred way to do it these days is to put a defer in your script as a little property here. You don't have to set it equal to anything, just put defer. If you don't do that, later on, you're going to get some interesting errors because it won't be able to access those elements. So those are kind of your two ways to do that. Either one's fine. Generally, this one's preferred. It should be slightly faster in most cases. Okay, so we do that. So now we have access to those three elements. And okay, we still have sort of the same layout here. Well, one thing we can check is that our HTML is showing up properly. So if you head over to your inspector, you can kind of see this is our whole body. There's our input button. And then even though we can't actually see the list, it is there and it does have the correct ID. So everything's working correctly. The next thing we're going to want to do is set up a event listener. So the way this is probably going to be strange for people, a lot of you who have only learned C or Java or languages that aren't necessarily event driven. Because this is a user interface, most user interface libraries are going to use a callback and event-based architecture. And what that means is your program is not running top to bottom the whole time. Because if you really think about what this page has to do, our code needs to wait until someone clicks. But we don't know, like, what if they also type? Like, they might be doing different things in different orders and they may never click. So you might think, okay, how are we going to check for this click? You might imagine like, okay, we could just do like a while loop and just keep checking to see, okay, have they clicked the button? Have they clicked the button? Have they clicked the button? But that's kind of inefficient to have like a loop that's just constantly checking for something they may never even do. So what you end up having is an event-based architecture. And the way that works is you have listeners. So the browser provides you with event listeners that you can use to listen for when things happen. And they run specific functions when those things do happen. So let's define a function that we can call this our click handler. You can call it whatever you want. And when someone clicks, let's just log out detected click. Okay, so notice we're not actually calling this here. And this by itself doesn't do anything. We also need to register it as the function that's going to be called when there's a click. So what you need to do for that is button.addEventListener. Click as a string, because there are different events you can listen. So there's like hover, for example, like if you hover over something, then you can call a function because, you know, maybe when they hover, you want to do an animation or something. There's different reasons you want to do that. So we do button.addEventListener on click. And then we pass in our click handler as the second argument. So this is something that's going to probably be especially strange for a lot of you coming from like a C-like language. In JavaScript, functions are first-class objects. So you can take them and pass them into other functions. Just like you could pass in a number or a string, you can pass a function into another function. And that's really important for an event-based architecture because that's how you tell it what to do. So we have our button, we're going to add an event listener. So we're listening for clicks. When a click happens, call this function. So if you go ahead and save that and then head over to our browser, reload, and let's click a few times. Open up our console. And you notice, okay, so it says detected click. And over here, it would normally show like 5, but you can see there's like a little 5 repeats here. If we click it some more times, you can see that number will go up. That's just to avoid spam. If it was said different things, it would print out multiple lines. So, okay, great, that works. But we don't want to just print something to the console when we have a click. We actually want to create a new item. So let's work on how are you going to create a new element. This is another DOM API you have access to. So let's get rid of this detected click. if you want to create a new element, you just do document dot create element. And then you pass in the kind of element you want to create. So we want to create a list item, right? Li, but you can create anything you want. So if you want to create a whole new list or an image or whatever you want, whatever kind of element you want to inject into your page, you can. But in this case, we want to create a list item. So document.create element li, and then that function will create our list item. Now we need to save that item. So save that into an item called list item. Okay, great. So we got a brand new list item, but this list item doesn't actually have any content in it. So in order to put content into the list item, we need to create a text node. So let's just put hello, for example, into it. All right, so we have hello. So now we've created our list item. We've created our text node, and then we need to put our text node inside of our list item. So the way you do that is append child, because this is, you can kind of remember, if we go back to our HTML is a hierarchical way of sorting things. So we have first our HTML tag. That's like the parent of everything. It contains all of these guys. So HTML has two children, the head and the body. And then head has 4 children, all these 4. And then body, you have your input. So that's kind of the like parent-child relationship you have going on here. So if you want to add a new child to an element, so in this case, we've created a new list item that we're going to add as a child to our ordered list. But inside of that list item, we want text, and that text itself is a child, because that text node kind of represents like this. So our button, right inside of our button, we have this click me that's just text. Well, that's a text node. So that's what that text node is talking about. So we're going to create a text node that just says hello for now. And then we're going to take our list item and append a child that is our text. So that basically what we've done is we've effectively done this. All right, so we've created inside of our JavaScript, we had this item just waiting to be added to the DOM. So we go back in here. Okay, how do we actually add it to the DOM? Well, we just want to use append child, but this time on our list. Okay, so are there any questions on any of that? So now if we click this, great, we've created a new item. If we click it more, it'll just keep creating more hello items forever and ever. All right, so great. We can now create items. Next thing we need to do though is actually not just create a hello item, is create an item that will be what people actually want. So we need to be able to type something in here and then click the button, and then it'll create the item based on what was in that box. So how do we do that? Well, another DOM API is .value. So if you want to get the value of an input box, you just do .value. So instead of creating a text node that has hello in it, we want to create a text node that has our input .value. So if we do this, now we can create, if we change this to something else, we can create different things. But one thing I will note is this isn't exactly the same way as my other one worked, right? Because when we click this, we're still, it doesn't like nicely clear this for them. Because usually you're not going to want to put like, do the dishes and then like you want to add it more times. Like you don't really want to do that. Usually you want to add different things. So it'd be nice if this would clear every time. So you can use value, input.value. You can just modify that variable to not have to be an empty string. So you could set it to something else you want. So if you want to just like maybe anytime they click the button, you want to just clear it and set it to high. You can do that. Oh, let me refresh. you can do that. It'll change to hi, right? But we just want to clear it, so we're going to do the empty string. Okay, we have a question in the chat. What's the difference between the list item and the list? Okay, so our list is defined here in our index.html. Basically, we can manually define list items. In order to have a list, you need to start the list. The list itself is an element. So the whole list is this OL. If you kind of hover over it, it says the OL element represents a list of items where the items have been intentionally ordered, right? That's what gives it the numbers. Inside of the list, you're going to have several items. So just like your to-do list, right? You might have a title for your to-do list, like to do. And then inside your list, you're going to have multiple items. So, do the dishes, take out the trash, study, whatever. And so if you were going to just write up straight up, just write a list in HTML without any JavaScript in it, then you could do something like this. And you just have these list items inside there. So that's the difference between the list itself is the OL, or the ordered list. That contains, it's the parent of all the list items. The list items, each list item is an individual item in the list. So we start with an empty list, then we add things. Hopefully that cleared things up. Okay, so now we kind of have it working a little better, right? We can type something, click the button, it will add it to the list, and then look, there's no longer any text in here. It'll clear it again. All right, so that's pretty good. Next, we want to try to implement the, well, there's a couple things we could do next. So why don't we do this, since we're already kind of related to that text box. One feature that you may have not noticed probably from my other version. So this is the kind of finished version, is you can hit enter. So you don't have to go and click the button, you can hit enter, which I find to be much more convenient than going and clicking the button. So that's kind of a nice accessibility feature. That way you don't have to go, type whatever, because personally, I hate taking my fingers off the keyboard and going to the mouse, right? Every time I switch between it just kind of breaks my concentration, slows me down. So it'd be better if we could just hit enter and do that. Well, there is a way we can do that. So we're going to have this is another event listener. So in this case, what we want to do is, if we think about what we want to do, when they're typing in this box, we want to listen to see if they type and enter. And if they do type and enter, then we want to click the button for them. So here's how you do something like that. I'm going to call this enter handler because it handles when an enter gets pressed, but you can call it whatever you like. If you're not too familiar with the arrow function, so this is how you would write it just normally. So if you want to have this E, actually E stands for event. So every time an event happens, like the click handler, for example, we don't really care precisely where on the button it was clicked or anything specific about that, right? So we don't need to take in any arguments for our function. But for the enter handler, we actually do, because we want to know, okay, what key did they press? Not just any key, we need to know specifically the enter. So that's when you need to take in this event argument. And in JavaScript, for arrow functions, you can, if you only have one argument, you can drop the parentheses to make it look a little cleaner. So if you have multiple things that you're passing in, then you can't do that. But if you just have one, you can drop the parentheses. And it's common anytime, you rarely see people put the parentheses if they don't have to. So you'll see this. Okay, so we take in our function event or enter handler here. We take in this event, and we want to check if what key they pressed. So the way JavaScript handles this, which is personally not my favorite way, but it has something called key codes. Basically, inside the event, you'll have a key code that represents what key we pressed. Maybe this will make more sense if we go down here and actually add the listener. So let's add our listener. So we need to go, we want to, again, this is for our input box, right? Because when they're in, if they hit enter somewhere else, we don't want to change anything. But if they're actually in this box and hit enter, that's what we want to listen for. So that's why I put it on the input element. So if we do input.add event listener, and we want to use the key down event. So this event gets fired, or this event it's going to call our function anytime a key goes down on the keyboard. There's also key up, which does something slightly different. So you may have like used applications where people used either one. The way key down works is as soon as you hit a key, it calls the function. Whereas key up waits for when you press the key, and then once you release the key, it calls it when you release. So usually key down is a little bit quicker because the key down is going to happen first. But if you want to like say delay the event from happening until they release the key, like maybe them holding it signifies something in your application, I don't know. Then that's why you might want to use key up. So that's what's going on there. But we just want to use key down, and we're going to use this our enter. We want to call our enter handler anytime. So this will fire anytime any key goes down. So now we need to check and actually see what key was sent down. Just for a test here. Say, trying to remember what the specific thing is. I don't remember off the top of my head, but likely we have Google. So this is something I encourage you to do. So if you forget how to do something, because like I forget how to do things all the time, and like everyone who writes code forgets specific things. Once you learn like several languages, especially, trying to keep like specifically all the differences between the languages gets pretty difficult. So like I routinely Google things that I forget or I just don't know how to do. No shame in doing that. Okay, so usually a good place to look is W3 Schools I like a lot, or developer.mozilla.org. MDN, the MDM docs tend to be really good. Okay, so okay, key code is what we need to use. And actually, it looks like, maybe this is even a better way to do it. It looks like there's also a key. I wonder what will happen. Let's try. Well, let's do key code first so you can kind of see how this works. So if you save that, let's fire up our console so we can see the stuff print out. All right, so I'm going to type A. Okay, so you can see that A is 65. If I type B, 66. C is 67. And like lots of different characters, they all have their own specific code. If I hit enter, 13. So this is good if you're just trying to remember a key code. Now I wonder what this, because they mentioned this event.key. Is that its ASCII value? I believe so. But don't quote me on it. It might be different. There are many different character encodings, but I believe that is the ASCII value. At least for the letters, I think it is. It might be different for some of the other ones. But let's actually check. I've never heard of this before. Let's try event.key. Maybe that's something new they've added. Maybe this will actually give us the straight up key, which would be much better anyway. Oh, that's nice. Okay. All right, let's do this. So instead of doing the whole ASCII value, that they must have added this, or I just didn't know about it. You can use event.key and it will actually give you the key that was pressed, including like backspace or enter. The reason you might prefer to do this, so it's going to functionally work the same regardless of what you do, because you can either listen. So we know that it's 13 we're looking for, but so just to give you an idea of what we're going to do, if we press if our key code is 13, then we're going to do stuff. Otherwise, we don't care, just ignore. And so this isn't necessarily terrible, but if we instead write it this other way, then we have the option of doing this. And whenever you can, if you always have a choice between two different ways of doing something, because in programming, there's often different ways to accomplish the same goal. You should try to use either the shortest way or the most clear way. So in this case, 13, even like I didn't remember specifically that was 13. right? A random person reading your code is probably not going to know that 13 is enter unless they've done lots and lots of development, super experienced. Whereas this event.key equals enter is much more clear in terms of, okay, that's the enter key that's being pressed. So because of that, I would prefer to do it this way. Whenever you can, try to choose the clearer way to do things, because then other people reading your code will have an easier time. So thank you so much. We have a question in the chat. This is a good question. What is the difference between equals and equals? Okay. So first, before the trivia, you should always use equals. Now, if you actually want to know what equals does, it probably doesn't do what you want. So I'm going to show you some examples of the bad things that equals can do to you. So Node, by the way, if you don't have Node installed, go back and watch the essential tools on our YouTube. They will help you get that installed. But Node lets you run basically JavaScript on the command line here. So you can just run this in your terminal. So, console log hi, and we'll print hi. Okay. So equals works like you expect. If you do 5 equals 5, you get true. If you try to compare things of different types, right? Okay, obviously false. If you try to compare arrays, false. What equals does is it will try to compare values of different types, and it will sometimes let it work. It tends to be very confusing exactly how that works, though. So for example, if you do this, what would you expect this to print? If you do 5 equals the string 5. Well, 1 is a string and 1 is a number. So if you kind of know how a string is represented, right, with ASCII character values, it's not, the ASCII value of 5 is not actually 5. So they're not the same. It's anytime you compare two different types, equals will always say that they aren't the same. False. Equals will attempt to convert one or both of the values in a way that they can be compared. So you have this 5 equals string 5, and it will say they're the same, which you might think, okay, that's kind of a nice feature. I like that. But the bad part about that is it has there's a lot of weird edge cases that don't necessarily work the way you think. So basically, it has more confusing behavior. It will let things like empty array equals 0. Does that make sense? Or if we have that. Does an array with 1 in it equal 1? Maybe. What about an array with 1 in it? Does it equal the string 1? Okay, maybe. But overall, it tends to not be what you want, because it's difficult to predict exactly what it will do. You shouldn't be, basically the moral of the story is you shouldn't be comparing values that are of different types. If you want to do that, then convert it yourself instead of using equals and letting the machine automatically try to compare it for you. Usually if you're trying to compare values of different types, you just made a mistake in your code. So for that reason, you should always prefer triple equals, never use double equals. This also goes for not equal. So if you're used to doing something like this, you should instead do double equals, exclamation point with double equals instead. So don't use this and don't use that. Instead, use this and that. That's one of the kind of warts of JavaScript that we're kind of stuck with because that's how it was originally made. But yeah, just use the strict equality. It's better. It will have more intuitive behavior and people will be less confused. Okay, so in this case, we want to go back to our event. So we're going to listen to see, okay, did they hit enter? And if they did, what do we want to do? So if they hit enter, we want to click the button. And it's actually, there's a DOM API for this. By the way, if it just seems like magic that like I know all these random APIs, it's just something you get with experience. So just literally look up, like how would you, I think to figure this out, I just said, how do you make enter click a button? And this is how you might do it. So what we're doing is we're listening to every single key that's pressed, right? So this input.add event listener key down. Every time we're focused on that input box and we press any key, this function gets called. That this event goes in as an argument. And then we check, okay, was the key enter? And if it was, we click the button. And if it wasn't, you could do something different. But in this case, we're just going to do nothing. So you do that. Great. Go over to here. So I don't know. Let's go back to dishes. Let me refresh this. Okay. So now if we hit enter, we now get the desired behavior. So that's how we implement that. Let's see. The last thing we want to do is get our checkbox and strike through. So, because if we look, let's try to make it look as similar to the other one as we can. So, okay, actually, so let's change this to add item instead of just click me. Okay, we have a question. Will it also work if you just call the click handler function? Oh, most likely yes. Yeah, so you're just saying do it like this? You could do that. One reason that I didn't originally, that actually may be a better solution in this case. One reason why I didn't originally do this is because I'm gonna show you how to like refactor this and clean this up to a more like idiomatic style that people use with anonymous functions, and you won't be able to do it this way if you choose to write it in that form instead. But yeah, this should totally just work the same, because when it gets clicked, basically the only difference is this one calls click. This actually might be slightly more efficient because this will just call this click handler directly, whereas this other one is going to emulate a click, which then has to go through this add event listener machinery, and then will indirectly call the click handler. So this might actually be better. Okay, so let's go with that. All right, so what was the next thing we need to do? So we changed that to add item like the other one. Let me actually make these the same size as well so we can see. Okay, good. The last thing we need to do is add that strike through behavior. So this is where we're going to need to use some CSS. So if we go over to our CSS, right now we just had this color equals red thing. That's from just the stock template. We don't need that. What we want to do is create a Strikethrough class. So this is called a CSS class. If you put a dot in front of a word, that creates a CSS class. You have to do this in your styles.css. You can use this to apply like some kind of formatting. So remember, CSS is your formatting language. You just use it only for arranging things, formatting. In this case, we're going to do strike through. So let's look up how to do strike through in CSS. So okay, so this is another one, W3 schools. So MDN and W3 schools tend to be pretty good. There's lots of different sites, but those are the ones I recommend. So CSS text decoration property, it says. So it looks like we can set this text decoration to overline. That will create a line like a bar above it. Line through, this is what we want. Underline, that will create an underline. And if you want to have like both, you can do underline and overline. But we just want this line through. That's our strike through. So, and you could call this class whatever you want. If you just want to call it like A or something, you can, but it usually should be descriptive as to like what it actually does. So text decoration, line through. Okay, and that's all the CSS we need to write. If we want to kind of test this just to see, like, how does this work? Let's create a list item, put hi. The way you would do this if you just had a static page, and like we're not doing it the JavaScript way, we just want to have the page look like this. You add a CSS class to something by just doing class equals and then that. If you have multiple classes, you can put another one in this list. So, you know, maybe we want to bring back our red. So if we want to be Strikethrough and red, maybe we have a CSS class for red. And there you go. Okay, so it makes it red and Strikethrough. But we don't really want red, so let's get rid of that. But that's how you can do multiple CSS classes. But the confusing part about this is we don't want to have to like type this out in our HTML. We want to be able to dynamically add it in through our JavaScript, right? So let's get rid of this. The way you interact with CSS classes is through class list. So this is going to be kind of a continuation of our click handler, right? Because when we create this new item, we want the item to, well, first, I guess before we even do the strike through, we need to make sure that there's that checkbox there so they can actually engage the strike through. So the way you do a checkbox, it's actually just another input, but its type equals, I think it's checkbox. So if we test that, yeah, okay. So that's how you make a checkbox. It's just another input element with type equals checkbox. So we go here. So now when we create this list item, we also want to add this attribute to it. So in HTML, if you missed that one, all of these little like equals things here are attributes. So this is the ID attribute. So our ID attribute is text box, and our type attribute is text. So we need to actually add this attribute onto the list item because we want the list item to have that strike through. So we just do attribute. I think it's just create. What is it? Create attribute. Oh, document. Document.create attribute. And then you need to, it takes in two values. So actually our autocomplete is trying to help us there. Oh, it was. Let's see if I can get it to show back up. Yeah. Okay, so create an attribute with a specified name. So we want to create an attribute that's, well, actually, we don't need to do this. We can just do, so you can create custom attributes if you want, but that's overkill for this. We can just do set attribute. So instead, sorry, you can use, so basically you can, if you want to create an attribute and then apply it to multiple things, one way you can do it is with create attribute. But if you just want to set it on one item, then you should just use set attribute instead. And instead, this is the one that takes the pair. So list item dot set attribute. So you take in the first string you pass in is what the attribute's called. So in this case, we need to set the CSS class, right? And then, because, hold on, what are we trying to do again? We need to, well, first we need to have this, okay, first we need to add, let's do that first. So first we need to add the checkbox. So create element, and then it's an input. So we can do, all right, so I'm just trying to separate this out so it makes, you want to use white space in your code to make sure that people, like the relevant sections are combined together. So here, we're going to create this list item, and we're going to create our text box, and then we can, I guess we can add our checkbox in that as well. So we have this input checkbox. There's no text or anything that goes inside it, so that's why we don't need to do create text node again. But what we do want to do for the checkbox is set our attribute. So we want to set, or no, where do we need to set the attribute? Because no, okay, we don't have to actually do that in there. We just want to, what we need to do is make it a child of the list item, because what do we want? We want this to look like, let's kind of mock up what we want this to look like. So we want to have our checkbox, so input. But then this is inside of our list item. Okay, that's what we're missing here. So we need, basically what we want it to look like when we're done is like this. And then, so we have our checkbox, and then we have our text. So let's actually take a look at that and see if that looks correct. Yeah, so this is what we want it to look like when we're finished. Unless we also could put the checkbox on the right side. Maybe that'll look better, I don't know. That's our other option. So we can instead put the checkbox on the other side. Does that make it look better? I don't know, what do you guys think? Let's see how I did it in this one. I put it on the left in this one, but we can put it either side in this. So right or left? Go ahead and vote. Left side without number would be good. Okay, yeah, we can do that. Let's put it on the left side then, and then if we have time, we can remove the number. Okay. So then we'll do it this way. So then in this case, we want to make sure we add the children in the right order. So first, we create our list item, right? So that's what's going on here on line 6. Create our list item. Then we create that text, and we create the checkbox. So we just created those. We haven't actually combined them together. What we want to do is put the checkbox first. So we'll take our list item and do dot append. So dot append child and append that. So we put the checkbox first because we wanted that on the left. Then we put our text on the right. So we append that second. And remember, this code down here is adding to the DOM. So we don't have to worry about that yet. Okay, so now after this has happened, we now have our list item with our text box, checkbox inside. And then we have our text node with our whatever they called, whatever is in that input box. And we've created that item. So now we should be good to go ahead and append that item to the DOM. And we also want to, this part, this input.value, remember that is clearing our text box so that they can type something new. So let's give that a shot. Oh, we still have that initial element. I guess it's fine. It doesn't affect anything. Oh, I don't think, okay, this is what we need the attribute for. So we didn't check it. We didn't change it. It just by default. So by default, input will give you a text area. That's why we need the attribute. So we need to make sure it's changed to checkbox. Okay, yeah. So notice in this one, it's type equals checkbox. But if we don't put a type, it will just default to text box instead of checkbox. There are many different inputs, but yeah, so you can see it'll just default to that. So that's why we need the attribute. So let's go back to our script. So before we append that checkbox in to kind of finish preparing the checkbox. So this is where you do set attribute. And then in this case, that attribute is called type, right? So in this case, we have type equals text, but we want type equals checkbox. So we do type, right? Because that's what we want to set, and then checkbox. And if we do that, it should do what we want. Okay, great. So now we have our checkboxes with our items. We can get rid of that default item since we've gotten that code working, so we don't need that anymore. Okay. Still check that it still works. Okay, great. Now we can check it. Now what we need to do next is when we click the button, it doesn't do the strike through, right? So the way you do that is you just set the CSS class. And you might think you just do this through set attribute, which I believe you can, but the preferred way to do it is to use the class list, because if you use set attribute, it'll override what was already there. And in some cases, you may not want to do that. Like you might have like global CSS, like all your buttons look a specific way or whatever, or all your checkboxes look a specific way. And if you set attribute, then you might change the one thing you want to change, but it will throw away any other CSS that people have added there. So you don't want to do the set attribute way. Instead, you want to use the class list. So this is actually happening. So this is all inside our click handler. What we want to do is when we click this button, we want to add the Strikethrough class, because let's actually manually add it. So if we go to inspect element here and go to our list item, we should be able to actually type in class equals in your console. Okay, so you can actually make edits to your CSS and HTML in your develop tools. It's pretty cool. And then look, it makes the Strikethrough like we want. So if we just add that class, it will automatically apply the style for us. So the way we can do that is set the class list. So we take our list item, class list, and then I think we just do pen. Hold on, let me check what I put in the master one. I don't want to show you the wrong way. Wrong thing. So this is another thing you can look at. If you go to your debugger, I think it is, you can actually see you can see your JavaScript files you've downloaded. You can do this for other pages you visit as well. So if we look at this, let's see, how did I set the, oh, toggle, okay. Yeah, all right. So in order to implement the behavior we want, so we don't want to just set, we could just set the class list to have Strikethrough on it by the default at the beginning. But when we add an item, right, like dishes, we don't want it to be immediately crossed out. We want to cross it out when? Well, when they click the text box, right? That's the intended behavior. This is the working one. So, and then we want it to go away when they unclick it. So that's why, in order to do that, we need to do another click handler. So we need to listen for when they click on the checkbox. So let's go back here. So if we go to our checkbox, so checkbox, that add event listener, click. And then, so this is, in the examples I've been showing you before, you see me define a function and then pass it in. But you actually don't even have to do that. You can use a lambda or an anonymous function. And the way you do that is instead of saying, okay, enter handler equals this function, and then using enter handler here, you can just substitute enter handler with that actual value. So we could write this like this instead. Just put that there and get rid of the enter handler, and that will work just fine. And it's very common to see people do it this way. Because especially if you're just creating a variable only to use it once, then it's kind of silly to create the variable. So we can go and refactor that later. But in this example, that's what we're going to do. So checkbox, add event listener. Now, do we care about the particular event? Not really. We just want to check for a click. So we don't need to like check if there's an enter or any specific click. And then what we want to do is toggle the CSS class. So go to our list item, class list. So class list is how you access the list of things that are in the CSS classes. And then toggle. And then we want to toggle our Strikethrough class. So toggle. Basically what toggle will do is whatever the value was before, it will flip it. So let's try this out. So now we click it, okay, strike through, unclick it, goes away. All right, so that's pretty good. I think the only feature we don't have is the disappearing feature. So mine, when you click it, it waits 3 seconds and then it will remove the item. The reason it doesn't just remove it immediately is maybe you made a mistake. Like you might misclick an item and decide, oh no, I actually don't want to do that. So then you can click it again and unclick it and it won't go away. So let's go ahead and add that feature. And then we should be able to, if you wanna, we can look up how to remove the number, because I know that is kind of unsightly. That's likely something we can do in CSS. So to start a countdown, you can use the set timeout function. So let's just kind of like ignore all this other stuff. Let's say we want to print out like 1, 2, 3 after 1 second, 2 seconds, and 3 seconds. You can use set timeout. Set timeout's an interesting function. It takes a function and a value in milliseconds. So if you want a second, a millisecond is 1/1000th of a second. So 1 second, you just do 1000. You can also do, so in this case, we want to do, well, we want to print that after 1 second, and we want to print 2 after 2 seconds. This is just an example of like something we could do with set timeout. If we actually pull up our console, one, 2, 3. All right, let me see. So let's reload the page. 1, 2, 3. So we'll run it after that much time has passed. So in this case, we don't want to set timeouts immediately when the page starts. But we do want to set timeouts after this thing gets clicked. So inside of our click handler for our checkbox. So right, so this is where we create the checkbox here, up here. Set it to make sure it is actually a checkbox. Then we're going to add this event listener. Whenever you click the checkbox, we're going to first toggle the strike through. And then we want to check, we want to start our 3-second countdown. Right, so let's start our 3-second countdown, and we can figure out what we want to do with that later. Okay, so after 3,000 milliseconds or 3 seconds, we're going to delete the item. And how do you do that? You just use remove child. So we go to our big list, and then we just do remove child. Instead of append child, you just remove child, and you just pass in the child you want to remove. So pass in our list item. Does that make sense for everybody? I know it might be, I may be throwing a lot at you this first time here. So basically the 3000 is how many milliseconds to wait. And then this open and close parenthesis, that represents our arguments of our function, right? So, because we're not saying we want to remove the child now. That's why we have to do this weird thing where we pass in the function, because we're doing the event-based architecture. We're going to set our timeout for 3000 milliseconds and say, okay, after those 3000 milliseconds, call this function. And this is a function that takes no arguments, and it will just remove the item that got clicked. So that's what's going on here. So let's try that. And we are like 90% of the way there. So let's do dishes and let's check it. See if it goes away. 1, 2, 3. Okay, boom, it's gone. But we do have a slight bug here. So if we check it and then uncheck it, it still goes away. And that's because the timeout is still happens either way. Because it just starts this clock. If we click it again, it will toggle again and it actually will set another timeout. So that's actually what that error you see in the console is. So see this uncaught DOM exception, node.remove child. The node to be removed is not a child of this node. So the reason we're getting that is because the first time we clicked it, it started a countdown. Then we clicked it again to uncheck it. It started another countdown. it removed it anyway because we didn't want it to be removed, but the first countdown finished, it removed it. And then like a few seconds later, the countdown happened again. And that's why we get this exception saying, okay, you're trying to remove it, but it's already gone. So this is not quite what we want. Does anyone have any ideas on how we can fix this? What do we need in order to, if we want to condition, because we only want to set this timeout if we haven't already set it before. And we want a way to unset it, which I'll show you if we have set it before. Basically, the easiest way to do this is an if. So do we still have to check if the attribute of the list item is still strikethrough? Yeah, so that's one thing. That's what we're going to do basically, is check if the attribute of the list item is still strikethrough. So let's check. So list item, so go to our list item, .class list, and then the easiest way to check is contains. So if you want to see if it contains, because it could have, you don't want to do equals 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 because there could be other CSS and then it won't match up because there could be other classes. So you just want to see, does it even contain, like, does it have the one that you want? So we check, does it have strikethrough? And I would do this before you change it, because if you do it, you can do it after you change it, but then your condition will be reversed because you'll have to be like, what was it? You'll have to think about what was it before I changed it? And like, what does that mean now? So I would do it before you change it. So before we change it, let's check. If it contains the strikethrough already, then we want to unset this. Else, so if it doesn't have the strikethrough, then we do want to set the timeout. So that's, now we put our set timeout in here. Either way, we want to toggle, right? But if we already had it, then we want to stop this timeout. If we didn't already have it, so our else case, then we want to kick off the timeout. Now, the only part we're missing is how do we stop the timeout? And set timeout, actually, if you read the documentation for it, should. Oh, that's not what I wanted. Okay, well, it returns a value, and that value is an ID that is the value of that specific timeout. So every time you make a timeout, it has a specific number that's associated with it. And if you want to cancel it, you can use that number to cancel it. So we just set our ID. So we need to add a ID variable that's outside of this that will persist. So we put it out there. Because remember, we need to be able to read it in this part of the if too. So we have that ID. And then here we want to check, or we want to, in this case, we know if we get to this case, if we get, if the class list does have strikethrough, we know they already clicked the button. So we know that the ID has already been set to whatever it is. This timeout's already ticking, right? We're in those 3 seconds before it disappears. If you want to cancel set timeout, then you can use, oh man, I want to say it's cancel. Let me check. There, so if you want to cancel it, you can use, there's a function, I think it's called, it's stop, it's slipping my mind. It's like set interval. That's one thing. It's hard, it's pretty difficult to remember all these different things. So I'm kind of rusty on a lot of this stuff because most modern applications, you don't want to write like this. So in the future, we're going to go into writing like a modern web application and how you would do that with like a framework. So I don't like routinely use these functions, but okay, it's clear timeout. Okay, so we need to use clear timeout is like your analog to set timeout. It will just cancel. And you just pass in the ID of the timeout you want to clear. Because you might have, remember, we might have multiple items. So maybe they've added like 6 items and they've done a check on each of them. Each one will have its own ID. And then we can clear it. So we're going to listen for the click. If they click and there's still a strikethrough, then let's stop the timeout because if there was a strikethrough, it's about to be flipped back to not strikethrough. And so we no longer want to remove the item. But if there wasn't a strikethrough, so if we get to the else, then we want to kick off that timer and then save the ID in this variable in case we want to clear it later, in case they decide to uncheck it. So if you do this, you should get the same behavior as my other one. So I'm going to do this. Now we can check it. Let's check if it'll actually delete. Meanwhile, let's add another one. Okay, so it deletes. And if we check it and then decide to cancel, okay, still there, didn't go away. So yeah, that was the main application that I wanted to write today. If you look, it looks the same between these two. We did have some comments that we wanted to try to remove this number. This is something I might search for this, remove OL numbers CSS. And so you can often, Stack Overflow is another great resource. So this is kind of like a site. I don't actually have an account here, but you can make an account and just ask questions to random people and they will try their best to answer it. And so looks like here they recommend setting list style type to none for our list items. So let's give that a shot and see. One thing you should do if you use snippets of code on Stack Overflow, make sure there is, if it's like a substantial amount, so something short like this, if it's not like particularly creative, you're probably not in violation of copyright law. But if it is something more complicated, then you could potentially get in trouble for using like copy pasting code from there. We also don't want to set things to blue. So what this actually does when you have two things here and you don't have the dot. So the dot gives for the class. That's if you want to make it your own name. This, if you don't use the dot, you're referring directly to elements. So we're going to say, okay, every ordered list element. So it takes every ordered list element, and then of all of those, go inside of it and look for list items inside of that. So that's what that does. And we're going to set list style type to none. So if we save that, I think that will have the behavior that you want.
Yeah, that looks good.
Yep. Okay. And it's gone. And so now you can check this, wait for 3 seconds, or you can cancel it if you want. You can, of course, tinker around with the values. And you can, when we do a CSS workshop, we'll probably try to like prettify it a little more because it looks pretty bad. But it does function. It does what we wanted to do. And we have an application. With that, I'll take any questions. It looks like a lot of people had to go or just didn't like the presentation, but I'll take any questions. And then I can also send you the code for the final thing if you're interested in that. Is there any way to remove, so we have a question, is there any way to remove the indent for the list items? I'm assuming, so what you mean is even though it hid the number, it still didn't like indent properly. That's a good question. I don't know. Probably. We could try this and see. So it looks like sometimes you can try different suggestions. So this person says list style none, just list style instead of list style type. Maybe that will affect it. I don't know. So we can give that a shot and see. Usually the easiest way is just to Google around and see if someone else has a way to do it. Sometimes there's no way to do it. But these things also change over time. So if you were here the other day, nope, that doesn't seem to fix it. All these languages are living standards. So over time they change. Okay, we have someone who wants the code. Yeah, I'll put the code in the chat here in a minute. Maybe left line. Yeah, that's possible. I'm not actually very good with CSS, if I'm being perfectly honest. So yeah, we could try margin 0, padding 0. Align items left and see if that helps. Okay, it doesn't look like it does. The other thing you could do is you could make a fake list. This is probably what I would do, not knowing any better. So instead of doing actual list items, you could just use a div. Because if you don't actually want the bullets, I did save. If you don't actually want the bullets or the numbers, then you don't really need to use a list. Like there's no real reason. So we could just use divs instead, and it probably will do what you want. Oh no, it's still. Oh, maybe I didn't refresh the page. Nope. Okay, maybe not. There is likely a way to do it, but I just don't know off the top of my head. Google around and see. when we do CSS, I'll probably look into that, see if there's a way to do it. I'll send you the code in the chat. So the code is at this link, like my finished version. There are actually, this one actually has some improvements over the, it's going to be slightly different. So my version, like I didn't know about the .key instead of key code. So I think it has the 13 in it instead. And it also does the functions. It does all of them the anonymous way. But the functionality is the same. There's your link. All right. Do we have any other questions? If not, hold on.